Harry Bradford was met at RAF Base Fairbairn and driven straight to Defence Headquarters at Russell Officers. The young officer had no idea he was walking into a formal inquiry conducted at the highest levels of the force.
Well, the inquiry was headed by an Air Commodore, and there were people from all areas of the Defence organisation with an interest in the nomad, people from the Army, people from the Defence purchasing area, people involved in the aircraft manufacturing side of Defence. So it was a wide group of people, most of whom actually held a view at that time that Aircraft Research and Development Unit was over the top in its criticism of the aeroplane.
What rank did you hold at that stage?
I was a flight lieutenant.
Was it daunting to walk into a room with such senior people?
Yes, yes, I can remember feeling quite intimidated, particularly as it became clear fairly early on in this inquiry that most of the people in the room were intent on attacking the reports and indeed my credibility.
Harry Bradford was grilled on his reports for a full week as senior officers tried to pick holes in his findings.
As the inquiry progressed, they progressively formed the view that the reports were correct and that the information was factual and the conclusions were sound.
And what happened to the reports after that?
The reports were withdrawn to reclassify. So there was a security classification applied to the reports. All of the ones that were in circulation were withdrawn and they were reclassified, and then there was limited distribution, strictly controlled. So while the reports were not withdrawn or discredited, their circulation was severely restricted.
Yeah, well, that's the stick that controls the tailplane.
Okay, right.
All right. And you pull and push that, and that moves the whole tailplane.
Here.
Because it's an all-flame tailplane.
Okay.
Not the conventional one, all-flame tailplane.
Right.
Harry Bradford's reports were also unwelcome at the government aircraft factory.
Really, there's an awful lot of tailplane there, and all the stresses and strains have got to go through that one small box there, which has given rise to some of those cracks in the talk box in there over a period of time.
Paul Hughes, who was a design engineer at the factory, had also pointed out problems to his employer. So what happened to his RAF colleague came as no surprise.
Well, stepping out of the party line, wasn't he? He was being a perfect individual, which the man was. He was part of a very professional unit, and they'd come up with some very professional answers, and they said, hey, this is it. This is what we have found. I mean, what's wrong with the truth? And people like it.
What do you mean that he was stepping out of the party line?
Well, everybody is supposed to be behind the nomad because it's Australian, because it was designed here, and you weren't supposed to knock it. And in their view, he was knocking it. And in my view, he wasn't. I'm not. But people would say, oh, he's a knocker. I'm not a knocker. Neither was Harry. He wanted it to be really good, something we could all be really proud of. And I can't see what's wrong with those sentiments.
Nomad successfully fills the gap between lightweight piston-powered 7- and 10-seaters and aircraft like the 18-passenger Metroliner and 19-passenger Twin Otter. Nomad. No wonder it's being flown worldwide in all its variations. In the vast outback of Australia, the iciness of Arctic Scandinavia, the searing deserts of Iran.
It was unpatriotic to criticise the nomad. The image was an Australian invention being snapped up around the world. But that was only part of the truth. 170 nomads were manufactured, but many of those were given away.
Start. Gear selector. Start. And have a green light. Right. Battery switch. It's on.
Australia donated 30 nomads to developing countries such as Thailand, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea.
The U.S. Customs Service has to be able to operate and maintain their fleet of searchmasters at a very high degree of readiness and reliability. They're not kidding that this is a war against drugs.
The US Coast Guard took 7 nomads in a deal which was much heralded by the Australian government.
Well, as I understand it, the US Coast Guard were never particularly keen to get the plane in the first place, but it was part of the deal whereby we bought from the US the Hornet, and in return they took a number of the nomads, which were suitably modified for their coastal surveillance.
But the biggest coup was selling the plane to the giant United States aviation business, the Hughes Corporation. Ultimately, though, that deal proved costly for Australia. Hughes claimed they'd been deceived over the Nomad. They took legal action and listed a number of defects it claimed it had not been told about. Hughes disposed of 15 of the 16 Nomads it had bought, and the Australian government paid a $4 million settlement.
Their prime objection was that the N24A had an airworthiness reduction in the gross weight that it could operate from 9,400 to 9,000 pounds, which reduced the profitability of the operation of the airplane, and that was their main concern.
But in its statement of claim, the Hughes Corporation said the airplane had 8 defects which made it unsafe for flying, including a defective tail design, with the result that the tailplane cracked.
Tailplane cracking, that was done with a 100% hindsight. The tailplane cracking came to notice in 1982. They're talking about 1979. The cracking problem wasn't a major issue at that time.
That was only one of the defects.
Okay, it's only one of them, but bear in mind...
But you've already agreed that there are some defects which you didn't know about and which you did not tell them about.
I didn't say any defects. I said I didn't know of Harry Bradford's flight test report.
By 1982, more problems emerged with the Nomad's tail section. Cracks appeared in the metal box which connected the 2 halves of the tailplane. And if that junction broke, the plane would simply fall out of the sky. It was the fatal flaw which 8 years later would bring down Glenn Donovan's plane. Paul Hughes documented the reports of tailplane cracking which he'd received from military and civilian operators. There were 11 in all. He warned that the situation was grave and recommended an urgent bulletin be sent out. What action did you want to see as a result of that report you wrote in 1982?
Well, first of all, the operators of all the aircraft should have been alerted to the fact that there was some problem there, and a quick inspection would help them out and say, look, before next flight, have a quick look before you go and just see.
Despite Paul Hughes' call for decisive action, the government aircraft factory sent out a watered-down version of his concerns. They feared bad publicity.
Presumably somebody felt that it was a little bit too straightforward and honest, and you shouldn't say these things. You know, you might upset the operator of the airplane.
Soon after, Paul Hughes resigned in frustration.
This public meeting of the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee, which is inquiring into certain matters relating to the crash of RAF Nomad aircraft A18401 on the 12th of March 1990. And I welcome Wing Commander Tobin. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name, address and the capacity in which you appear today?
13 years after it was written, that document warning of bad publicity over the Nomad's tailplane has become central to a Senate committee inquiry. The committee is examining the wreckage, trying to determine why it is that the tailplane of Glenn Donovan's Nomad cracked and broke in mid-flight.
There's a memo in 1982 from a part of the management of the government aircraft factory indicating there are faults with the tailplane design, and secondly that those faults should be kept secret and covered up because of the impact, the negative impact this might have on potential sales in terms of lack of confidence.
The government aircraft factories argued that that memorandum was written by a junior officer who really had no authority.
I think a junior officer in any business doesn't write those sorts of memorandums, which is a fairly blunt memorandum, unless it reflects the prevailing philosophy of the organisation at that time, i.e. that the concern here is that safety is secondary to commercial considerations, that they seem to be prepared, according to that memo, to sacrifice safety concerns because it might impact on selling planes. Now that's completely untenable.
Try experimenting a little bit with slight variations in power in your right-hand engine.
For its entire life, the plane flown by Glenn Donovan was used as a test aircraft. In this video, shot by the government aircraft factory in 1987, it's undergoing wind flow tests.
Delta Control, this is Nomad section. Pan. Nomad 1 has noticeable airframe vibration. Okay, take it back to your threshold speed, trim it at this height. If you don't like it, use those chutes. You can probably get...
Indeed, during this flight, the pilot experienced handling problems and was forced to make an emergency landing.
All right, I just want to check the wheels down and we should be all right. Into the runway. Okay.
Then, a year before it crashed, Glenn Donovan's Nomad was subjected to ground running tests like this. They were conducted at the government aircraft factory, or ASTA as it became known. These pictures show how much strain is taken by the tailplane.
Now, it may be that the ground running was the main cause of the crash. We'll have to determine that at some later date. But certainly it was appropriate for the RAF to know that a few hundred hours of ground running, or close to 200 hours of ground running, had occurred with all the stresses and strains that puts onto a tailplane, and you've seen for yourself how stressful that can be.
ASTA can't say how many hours Glenn Donovan's plane was subjected to ground running, nor can they say how long a tailplane can last, although they claimed in the early years of the Nomad project that it had a life of 130,000 hours.
In reality, they had no means by which to test that, and it was all theoretical.
Did they ever know the precise fatigue life of the tailplane?
They never have, and they still don't. And at the time of the accident, they certainly didn't. They've conducted tests since Glenn's accident, but there's still no conclusive proof that they actually know how long the tail will last before it cracks.
There's no doubt that a more vigorous response would have found the problems sooner.
ASTA may not have known the life of the tailplane, but 9 months before the crash, a civil aviation official, Martin Aubrey, twice wrote to them about cracking problems. He told them of 4 tailplane cracking reports he'd received from a civilian operator.
And the government aircraft factory in that situation was responded less than optimally. I mean, I don't want to preempt the findings of the committee, but I think it's very clear to anybody that if you receive 2 notifications from the CAA, then you should be able to assess whether they are significant and respond appropriately and quickly, and that clearly didn't happen.
Although some civilian Nomads have experienced cracking problems, with modifications and strict servicing, they're still permitted to fly. But the restrictions mean the Nomad can't be used for its original purpose, short takeoff and landing.
Furthermore, the sensationalist publicity flowing from the Ombudsman's report and this committee's hearings have unfairly affected the reputation of a capable aircraft, which is giving good service to operators around the world.
The company which built the plane still believes it's been a success. Despite increasing revelations of cover-up from the past, they're continuing to insist the Nomad's been unfairly judged.
We don't think it's of interest. You've actually stated here that 12 aircraft have been involved in fatal accidents, whereas in fact the facts are, as I understand it, is that there have been 18 write-off accidents.
You may be correct,
So you don't think that's of relevance to the committee, though?
ASTA says that it's wrong to claim, as you have, that the Nomad has been involved in 19 accidents with 56 people dying.
Well, they then gave us information which was, again, economical with the truth, I think is a fair way of describing it. They said that there had been, I think, if I remember rightly, 13 fatal accidents and 48 people had died.
Why would they try to downplay those numbers?
Well, I mean, there's always been a perception that GAF and ASTA's responsibility was to try and make this plane into a commercial success and to make sure it is a continuing success. And they are protecting the good name, if you like, of the Nomad aircraft.
ASTA declined our request for an interview.